My name is Ernie Chambers. I'm a member of the Nebraska legislature, and I have been in this office for 46 years. Therefore, I know something about politics, and I'm going to read this story because I want the students to understand that you're never too young to learn very important lessons, and we all like stories. Even I do at my advanced age. I am 82 years old, and that's very, very old, even for an elephant. The name of this book is Grace for President. These are some of the men who've been President of the United States. Now, let me begin. Grace for President is a book that was written to deal with the question of whether or not there should ever be a lady, a female, a woman as President of the United States. And before elections occur, there will be a lot of campaigning. Those who are running will print signs. They will have banners and posters and buttons trying to persuade people to vote for them so that they can win. There was a teacher named Mrs. Barrington, and Grace was in her class. Mrs. Barrington put a poster on the room wall of all of the presidents who had ever served this country. And Grace was looking at that poster. This was on a Monday morning in September. Mrs. Barrington rolled out the big poster with all of the pictures on it, and Grace Campbell could not believe her eyes. "Where are the girls?" she asked. "That's a very good question," said Mrs. Barrington. "The truth is, our country has never had a woman president." "No girl president ever?" Grace asked. "No, I'm afraid not," said Mrs. Barrington. Grace sat at her desk and stewed. No girls? Who'd ever heard of such a crazy thing? And there sits Grace, stewing at her desk, wondering why there had never been a woman president. Grace raised her hand. "Yes, Grace," said Mrs. Barrington. "I've been thinking it over, and I'd like to be president." Several students in the class laughed. "Well, I think that's a star-spangled idea, Grace," said Mrs. Barrington. "In fact, we can have our own election right here at Woodrow Wilson Elementary." The snickering in the room stopped. Grace smiled. "Would anyone else like to run for president?" Mrs. Barrington asked. Nobody raised their hand. "Ah," thought Grace, "becoming president was going to be very easy." But things don't always work out the way we think. Mrs. Barrington made an announcement. "In the name of democracy, I've invited Mr. Waller's class to join our election. Their class has nominated Thomas Cobb to be their presidential candidate." Grace's heart sank. Thomas was the school's spelling bee champion. His experiments always took a blue ribbon at the science fair, and he was captain of the soccer team. Becoming president was not going to be so easy after all, Grace thought. And the expression on her face showed how concerned she was. The next day, Mrs. Barrington let them know that Mr. Waller's class was going to be a part of the election. The teacher put the names of all 50 states and the District of Columbia into a hat. Everyone except for Grace and Thomas got to choose a state. "I'm Texas," said Anthony. "I'm New Hampshire," said Rose. "I'm Michigan," said Robbie. "What does the number 16 mean?" "Each state is assigned a number of electoral votes. That number is determined by how many people live in that state," said Mrs. Barrington. "Each of you will be a representative for your state. Altogether, our country has 538 electoral votes," Mr. Waller explained. "On election day, the candidate who receives 270 electoral votes or more wins the election. Remember, the one who wins 270 or more votes wins the election." "Why 270? asked Rose. "That's more than half of all the electoral votes," Mr. Waller said. Becoming president really wasn't going to be so easy, Grace thought. Grace began to campaign. She had a campaign slogan. That means a statement that will represent her campaign. Thomas came up with his own campaign slogan, and they each made a large sign which carried their slogan. "Make history, vote Grace Campbell for president," said Grace's sign. "Vote for Thomas Cobb, the best man for the job," rhymed Thomas Cobb. Grace listened to what issues were important to the students, and she made a list of campaign promises based on what the students told her. Her sign said, "A peaceful school, no bullies. A cleaner school, no littering. Better hot lunches, no more fish stick tacos." And her supporters were very happy. Thomas made up his own list of promises. Free tutoring, free soccer lessons, fish stick tacos every week. In addition to the signs, Grace made campaign posters and buttons. Thomas made posters and buttons also. And by the time they got really into the campaign, you can see how many signs and posters were scattered around the schools, in the hallways, and the lunchroom, and each side, Grace's and Thomas's, was very pleased with the signs that were up. Each week, the teachers set aside time for the candidates to meet with their constituents. Those are the ones who will vote. Polls were taken. Voters were making their choices. Thomas had a friend who thought he was clever. So he said to Thomas's supporters, "You all don't know the name of Thomas's father, do you?" And Thomas was wondering, what is this going to be about? So they said, "No." He said Thomas's father's name was Corn. And everybody looked puzzled, and the student said, "Corn Cob." And everybody laughed. So another student who thought he was funny said, "Well, if Thomas had a father, Thomas's father had to have a father." And everybody nodded, "Well, that's right." And his name was Pop. And everybody said, "Well, I guess he called his father Pop." "No, Popcorn Cob." And everybody laughed. Grace continued to campaign. There were no jokesters among her supporters. At recess, she gave speeches because she was very serious about this. No playing around. During lunch, she handed out free cupcakes, and naturally that made everybody happy. And after school, she held rallies where the students came together, and she gave speeches, and sometimes others had things to say in support of Grace. What was Thomas doing all of this time? Thomas was a bit more serious. He was what you call a scholar. So he was doing all of the campaigning things, but he wanted to do some calculating. He wanted to do some figuring. He knew that there had never been a female president of the United States. So he wanted to see how many students were in the classrooms who would be voting, but he didn't want to know just the total number. He wanted to know the number of boys, in case he could get all of them to vote for him, and the number of girls, in case they all voted for Grace. And he, being clever, calculated that the boys held slightly more electoral votes than the girls. So he felt pretty good. So instead of doing the kind of things that Grace did, at recess, Thomas studied his spelling words. During lunch, he worked on his latest science experiment. After school, he played soccer. And all of the students wondered why Thomas conducted himself in such a fashion. But Thomas had done his calculating. He had counted the votes. Even before the election, Grace made good on her promises. She joined the safety squad. She organized a school beautification committee, and she volunteered her time in the school cafeteria. And she worked so hard that by the end of the day, she was tired. But when she settled down in the comfortable, easy chair, she had a satisfied smile on her face because she had done everything that day she thought should be done. As time passed, November rolled around. In early November, Woodrow Wilson Elementary School hosted a special Election Day assembly. Finally, the big day had arrived. All of the students were assembled in the gymnasium. Grace and Thomas took their places on stage as the school band began to play. Now comes decision time. Henry was the first representative to approach the microphone. The Yellowhammer state of Alabama cast its 9 electoral votes for Thomas Cobb. And there was a cheer. Fletcher was next. He said, the last frontier state of Alaska cast its 3 electoral votes for the best man for the job, Thomas Cobb. Then a girl spoke, Hannah, and she called out, the Grand Canyon state of Arizona cast its 11 electoral votes for Grace Campbell. And so it went. State after state after state cast their electoral votes. The scoreboard in the gymnasium kept track of the totals. Generally, it kept scores of basketball games. But in this instance, something far more important than a basketball game was occurring. Basketball was recreation. Voting, elections, this was education. The voting demonstration was quickly coming to an end. Clara approached the podium. The Badger state of Wisconsin cast its 10 votes for my best friend, Grace Campbell. And Grace felt pretty good. But then she looked at the scoreboard. Thomas had 268 electoral votes. She had 267. There was only one state still unaccounted for, and that state was Wyoming. And Sam was the one who was going to make the decision. 270 or more votes would be needed to win. Sam was not the most important nor the most popular student in school. He wore thick glasses he didn't have many friends, but today he played a very important role. He held in his vote the next president of the classes. Sam approached with a smile on his face. Thomas grinned because the boys had given him more votes than Grace. Grace felt sick. Sam walked up to the microphone. He looked at Thomas. He looked down at Grace's handmade flag. Sam didn't say a word. The band continued to play. "What are you waiting for?" Tom whispered. The band stopped playing. All eyes were on Wyoming. Finally, Sam cleared his throat. The equality state of Wyoming casts its 3 votes for, and everybody wondered who would get those 3 votes and be president. Grace Campbell! Grace was very happy. The girls were very happy, and at least some of the boys. The gymnasium erupted in loud cheers and a few boos. Mrs. Barrington approached the podium. With 270 electoral votes, the winner is Grace Campbell. Thomas looked stunned. Grace hugged Sam. "Why did you do it?" she asked. Sam handed Grace his flag. "Because," he said, "I thought you were the best person for the job." The following week, students in Mrs. Barrington's class were preparing for the Career Day presentations. Grace volunteered to go first. She stood at the front of the room and glanced at the poster still hanging on the wall. "My name is Grace Campbell," she said, "and when I grow up, I'm going to be President of the United States." This time, everybody believed she would. So all of you out there, understand that you should not believe anything is too hard for you, but you must prepare yourself, study, pay attention to your teachers, learn as much as you can about as many things as you can, and maybe, who knows, where you will wind up. And that is the end of this story, but it's not the last picture in the book. That is Mount Rushmore, with Grace's face joining that of the other 3 presidents: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, and Grace Campbell. So all you young ladies out there know that there is hope, but you're going to have to be the one to make it a reality. And that ends the story for today.